So, greetings, shalom, and welcome to Outside the Class. It's January 17th, 2023, and we're continuing in our Matthew series. We're in episode 24, Two Ways to Miss Jesus. And this is just part one. Okay, so with this way of doing things, you can watch the videos before we begin chatting. We hope to keep these to around 15 minutes or so, right? Easy to catch, easier to catch up on. And we have the Dusty Feet on Thursday nights, 7 p.m. Eastern. In the description below are links to all the audio, video, and source documents that we use here in the Dusty Feet. We want to make sure that any material we use here is properly credited to those folks who work so hard to bring it to us. Without their efforts, learning we do here does not happen. So don't forget to subscribe. Click that bell icon if you want a reminder. And as always in the Dusty Feet, this is a place we can safely explore the endless ways of God, interconnection of His creation, where belief understandings may be challenged, divine misunderstandings may exist, and traditional teachings might falter as we pursue connection, context, and community with God and each other here in an environment of grace and love. So here we go with some outside the class on the Dusty Feet. And again, and as always, it is expected that you watch the reference videos first so you can get a context for this discussion and hear the perspective of the originator. Again, in this case, it's Tim Mackie. So I do link all of the videos for each week in advance on TheDustyFeet.com on the Outside the Class page. But if you haven't done it yet, then pause this, click on the link in the description below, and when you come back, then we can chat. So we're back. Okay. So I'm a big fan of optical illusions. I love how it helps me to remember that there really can be different ways of viewing the same thing. And the fact that we're looking at the same thing, and yet we really can be looking at them differently. This will become more complex when we address in this perspective. It's often the challenge emerges as to then which is right? And our paradigmatic need to be correct, right? So I really relish this challenge. So I have a few more illusions to discuss, right? We'll stretch ourselves further with the change in perspective, right? Because with two-dimensional pictures, we are all aligned with that same view, that same perspective. But when that object becomes something that can be viewed from another side or an angle, we really do see those changes, right? Depending on where one stands. And you know what? We can call that a paradigm. Interesting. So this is the original, right? The original picture that we had in the video. And again, which do you see, the young lady or the old woman? Tim kind of had a nice, interesting view on a bit of those, which I enjoyed. This is one that's a classic, and this is that 6-9 thing. This is this is a classic, and it's where one stands, and both arguments you would think were legitimate arguments. But the question that gets posed from this is, if you went back to the original author and found out if you could, what would they tell you? Interesting thought to think. And then I did a perspective series many years back on the Dusty, and I probably should bring it back up again because it did have some fun stuff to talk about. But this is basically the graphic from it. It showed in that perspective piece that one would sit and discuss. And look, from my light, as I shine it, it's square. From my light and I shine it, it's round. And it's true. They both are elements of it. They are shapes that can be reflected from it. But the shape is just a bit more complex. And then just recently, I found another one that stretched me, Bob, even more. I love this picture. And I think of sometimes maybe, I don't know, in my head about how people say, the ways of God and the perceptions of God, and His ways aren't our ways, and there's so many different things that go in, and so we try to fill in blanks and do things to fill in the squares, and I look at a picture like this and I go, yeah, each of those points are valid, but that shape is so much more complex. Does make it a bit more interesting. But it still does challenge me to realize that we still are only seeing a glimpse of the lives and the events that are in Scripture, right? We're only getting a peek of them at best. Okay, so maybe for a more practical example, and we cover this in Dusty Feet, the trip from Capernaum to Tyre Sidon is about 35 miles, right? So what did you picture with the event, right? Okay, so just walking alone, a person has an average walking speed of 3 miles an hour. So if you walked for, say, 8 hours straight, right, you'd cover 24 miles. That's no stopping, no eating, no bathroom breaks. That's just walking. So it's probably safe to say for 35 miles, you would require a stop. And by a stop, I mean an overnight. So, did they stop at a Motel 6? How do they sleep? How about food? Did they eat? Right? we have a reference to forgotten food later in the chapter, right? So we can assume that they did bring their own. So did you picture them just wandering along with nothing? We've seen some depictions of Jesus and the disciples, and they're walking along, maybe with a staff in hand, a walking stick. But did they need to carry extra clothes, right? Sleeping arrangements. These are things that are these things part of your perception picture? Perception is more than just a story told, right? A picture you can see, right? Because it really affects everything, whether we realize it or not. We read a book, any book, and when you hear the author, because yes, sometimes we tend to even translate those words on a page to sounds in our heads, right? We've created an image and those sounds from the words on the page. Clothes worn, hair length, facial hair, maybe even an accent. In the Bible, right? It's no different. In fact, it might even be more muddled than a normal story. Tim used the phrase that your brains can at times get trapped, right? When trying to see or picture something, especially if we have an initial view or a certain paradigm picture, right? And then changing that's going to be challenging. So let's say we do have a view, a paradigm of something. Let's say it's the age of the disciples. So in by far most of those depictions that we have of the disciples, they're old men, right? The Last Supper, maybe, arguably the most famous picture of Jesus with the disciples. Oh, side note. Do you know where that famous picture is? That famous picture is in Milan, Italy. And here's where the picture is. As we get up close, I think the thing that hit me on this one was that there's a door in the middle of it, because that door's been sealed off, but there was a door in the middle of that, and that picture, just the way that the artist depicted it and drew it on, and we could talk about the artist and all of his work some other time. But this picture, this is one you piece. However, that's not how you picture it. The picture in your head probably looks like this. Notice there's no doorway in the bottom of the picture, but this is one where it's been refreshed, colorized, and you see the picture. This is how the predominant, this is the predominant picture globally for Jesus and the disciples. Interesting thought. This is arguably, right, the most famous picture we have. And it does put those pictures in our heads, and then how do we view that moving forward, right? Because I guarantee you it has an impact on how you view all of the stories with the disciples going forward, right? Are they young? Are they old? But then maybe you're asking, does it matter? Does it? I'll give that something to just think about. That's fair. So Tim brought up a point about the Pharisees and the Sadducees together. Before we'd seen the Pharisees and the scribes, but now we have someone else to add to the equation. So these two religious groups, for the most part, they do not get along for a number of reasons. So for the audience that this was directed to, this story, right? This is actually a big part of the story. Because Tim said these two, they spit venom at each other, except when they had a common enemy. So now remember this Capernaum area. And for the most part, this is the area that Yeshua spent the most time in. This area, this region around this. And that's 100 miles from Jerusalem. So as Tim mentions, they probably viewed Yeshua as this hick preacher teacher, right? I think more along the lines of this rogue traveling rabbi. Yet these powerful leaders from Jerusalem made him up again. They're demanding a sign. It's an interesting paradigm perspective question. Do we need signs to cause us to believe? Do we ask God for signs? We base our faith or our allegiance to see one. Do we? That's another thought to chew on. Yeah. So when we get to this next interaction with these leaders, with another sign request, Jesus' answer is still very much a perspective answer. He says, you can see that, the weather, right? But you can't see the times you're in. It's that old forest for the trees. I don't know, right? So the sign that he's addressing, the sign they're in, That's reflected, patterned in the Jonah story. So in part 2, we'll get to that and another story with bread. Interesting. So our point to ponder, and our point to ponder again, I'm sticking with it because I think it's important. Make no judgments where you have no compassion. Again, make no judgments where you have no compassion. And thanks again for being with us today on Outside the Class with the Dusty Feet.